Talia. So, 2010, in my living room, with a bunch of really top down and bottom up. And we had been doing some tremendous work for the first 4 years, really shaking the bushes, raising the conversation, making noise, training mayors, educating school children and teachers, literally chambers of commerce, anybody who would say hello to us. We had Climate 101s, we had 4-day trainings with Hal Wanless, and then 2-day trainings, 1-day trainings. We weren't reaching the soccer moms, so we started having wine and cheese, ask the expert panels, and of course they would slow down long enough for some wine and cheese. And we were finding ways to engage disengaged segments of society. All of this happened at Pinecrest Gardens because of my friend, the mayor of Pinecrest Garden at the time, Cindy Lerner, said, come, do your thing. We will give you office space. So we used that garden to host a varied number of events, from panels with school children to panels with film critics and so on. And then around 2014, I started feeling that while the tent was getting bigger and fuller, there was a group that was missing. And the group are my people. Because although I'm a scientist and a school teacher and a high school principal and all those things, I'm really just a third world animal. I was born and raised in Port of Spain, Trinidad, and I consider myself a person of color. And I realized in 2014 that they weren't coming to our events. We had to go into the neighborhoods that mattered if we really wanted to evoke change. I also started reading the Alice reports. Laura from United Way, are you here? The United Way is becoming a firm partner with the CLEO Institute, and their Alice reports are something that we all need to look at. The latest one just came out, the 2018. ALICE stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, but Employed. It is a study that tells us not just who's poor at the federal poverty level, but who's the working poor, who's living paycheck to paycheck and really can't handle an unexpected cost of $400 a month or go 2 weeks without a paycheck. These are very vulnerable people. There are, for the sake of round numbers, almost 3 million people living in Miami-Dade County. Almost 60% of us are poor or working poor. That is a lot of people. And when you look at climate, and when you look at social justice, you see this. The social justice movement has had to grow in intensity tremendously. And the climate disruptions that are here and coming are threat multipliers to these vulnerable communities. And nobody knows that better than me and the panel that's here, and Nancy and David and Michael and all of these people with whom I have worked for the past dozen or half a dozen years. And here's the deal, folks. If they tell you Hurricane Irma is coming, get a week's worth of food and water and be ready to live on that for as long as you can. You go out and you get your food and water. What if you don't have the money? And you can't get that? What if you can't board up your home? What if you can't get to the evacuation site, or you get to the evacuation site and it's closed because the roof's leaking and nobody told anybody? These things are life changers. What if Hurricane Irma, that didn't hit us, disrupted your place of work so much and your home that you could not get to work for 2 or 3 weeks and you don't get a paycheck? So for those 2 or 3 weeks, you're either buying medicine or food. You have choices to make. So it is very difficult. So in 2014, determined to make inroads in these communities of color, I went to one of our funders, I'm not going to call names, and I said, I really want some money to pilot a program in Liberty City and Little Haiti that are on high ground, and Shawcrest and Sweetwater that are on low ground. And would you please help us by giving us some money to do this pilot? And the answer was, oh no, we don't fund that. Sounds like a great cause. And I literally had a temper tantrum. I did. I burst into tears. I stomped my feet. And I said, what is it going to take for us to give people the knowledge and the skills to advocate in their own interest? They're against a solar amendment because they were not informed enough to advocate in their own interest. So the moral of that story is temper tantrums sometimes work. Because we got the money, and that pilot continues today, 5 years later. And it is because of the work we did in Liberty City and Little Haiti and Sweetwater and Shawcrest that I met these beautiful people. Valencia Gunder, who's in the middle there, is one of the first persons I met. So in each of these cities, we went in and we listened for a couple weeks. Sometimes we went to a listening session with our posse of friends. FIU was with us, Union of Concerned Scientists with us, Catalyst Miami was with us, Miami Workers Center was with us. We had a lot of people. And we went there to listen, and sometimes we showed up and nobody was there. So we had to go back. And we would go back to the point where we say, okay, what do you know about climate change? What do you want to know? If we had a town hall, what would you want to discuss? And we would find somebody in that group who could run the town hall, so it wasn't CLEO coming into their little neighborhoods and telling them what's what. And as a result of those town halls, people found their voices. And then the third thing we did is the Climate 101 training, where we encourage people to become climate speakers. Valencia, I keep picking on her because she's my BFF. She went from 0 to 100 in 10 seconds in terms of being a climate speaker. She's now a sought-after speaker around the country. As a result of that work, we started going to planning meetings for the first Miami People's Climate March in 2015, the first big one. We had a smaller one thanks to Sam Van Leer in 2014. And that group that was planning that march were really clear on the justice lens, that climate is a threat multiplier. And we worked hard to come up with that march and to let people know that Miami cared about climate action with the frontline communities and Marlene Bastien and all of these incredible local leaders leading us. And then we could not stop meeting. We wanted to keep seeing each other, so we formed the Miami Climate Alliance. So the Miami Climate Alliance was formalized as a result of a series of things that have happened with all the people who know that social justice matters, understanding that climate is a threat multiplier to these concerns. So today, we have this rich panel that is going to share their lens as to what climate justice looks like from where they sit and what they think are the messages we all need to take away from today. So our guest today, oh, look at our pictures. Oh, they keep putting that thing up. Anyway, Kilan Bishop is Dr. Kilan Bishop. She just returned from a 3-month stunt as a National Academies of Science Fellow for Engineering and Medicine. Her PhD is in cancer biology. She's an environmental justice warrior. And she's a member of the Sea Level Rise Committee for the City of Miami. Welcome, Kilan. We have Valencia Gunder. She's a climate justice advocate, a Climate Speakers Network graduate, the founder of Make the Homeless Smile, and she has served over 38,000 meals between Miami, Florida, and Atlanta, Georgia, to the population that needs it most when they need it most. She is a rock star, and I'm proud to call her my friend. And then the man with the ponytail, Adrian Alberto Madriz. Adrian is he who shall not be messed with, we like to call him. He is the CEO, is that what we call you now, of the non-profit version of STS. Do you know what STS is? Smash the Slumlords. He is big on housing for all and climate gentrification. So because he wanted to run the non-profit arm, we created SMASH, which stands for the Struggle for Miami's Affordable and Sustainable Housing. SMASH. Welcome, Adrian. So I have asked these three people, and we're going to start with Kilan, and then Valencia, and then we're going to close with Adrian, and then we'll circle back around with some questions. So I asked each of them to think about their takeaway message on climate justice and how you think everybody in this room that has a different lens, really, ought to look at the issue of climate justice. So let me start with you, Kilan, and tell us your words of wisdom for this crowd.
So...
yeah, you're done. We're hearing you. It's very loud.
So I'm a molecular biologist, a cancer biologist, and my first thought when I was invited to do this kind of work, because that's how it happened, I was recruited, was great, yes, recruited by this one here. And I was like, I don't have a climate background, but I do have a health background. So I can start these conversations around climate and health on this committee, because that was where I felt like I could be the most impactful. Then I went to my first committee meeting, and I realized that that's not where the needle was. This was a very development-focused committee. They were focused on the built environment. They were focused on infrastructure. And so I saw an opportunity instead to just shift the conversation from property to people. And that's been my approach ever since. Any conversation that the committee starts, any conversation that I'm a part of when it comes to resilience, period, I want to humanize it. Because that's how you reach communities that don't have time to think 10, 15, 20, 50 years into the future. Communities that have very pressing concerns that affect them today. You relate climate and the changes that are coming to what they're experiencing now. That's how you engage people that have been historically disengaged. That's how you further the work that CLEO started and that many people continue. And it's been, in my experience, and I think that my fellow panelists will speak to this, very effective, because climate is a threat multiplier. So if you have biomedical scientists like myself that want to talk about cancer biology, then you talk about, okay, in what ways does climate intersect with chronic disease? If you have people who want to talk about displacement, affordable housing, gentrification, then you go, okay, where are people migrating to? Where do they come from and where are they going? And you start realizing that there are patterns that if we don't address now, we'll have to address in the future. If you care about economics, then you say, okay, well, what do you define as an asset? There are plenty of people, probably even in this room, who would define assets as built structures, you know, housing or resources, assets that a community, typical assets that a community has. I define assets as people. And so it shifts the way that you have a conversation when you begin to humanize things. And that's really the takeaway message that I want you all to have. The way in which you engage people is to talk about them, not yell at them about something that you think they should care about.
Well said. Valencia, what is your message for this crowd?
You sure you want to give me the mic? Okay.
Yes, I do.
How y'all doing? All right. So, and I wouldn't have a climate career if it wasn't for her. So, one, I was honored to be asked to come speak today, so thank you. And I thought about like what resiliency and equity looks like, and the fact that when I'm a part of resiliency conversations, as I sit on the executive committee for the 100 Resilient Cities for Greater Miami, oftentimes, just like Kilan said, it's focused on the infrastructure and the roads and pumping water and things like that. And the conversation of food safety and water safety and crime were not just to the forefront. It was brought up very minimal, but it was other things that was happening in our communities that people were not paying attention to when it came to resiliency. So I and my strongest voice, like always, was in the room oftentimes like, listen, people care about their food, people care about their health, people care about their livelihoods. They don't care that we need to cool the earth off, right? So how do we intersect those two things? People don't understand that their food safety and their water safety is being affected because the earth is so hot, but we're not teaching that. And then when we do go teach it, we're using big terminology. I know the science words, mitigation to adaptation, and all of these things that people like, what is all of that? So what I did, I took the Climate 101 workshops that CLEO Institute taught me, and I broke it down even more. And I started doing climate workshops in all of our underserved communities, all the way down to Homestead, Goulds, Perrine, Alapata, Doral, Hialeah, Liberty City, Little Haiti, Opelika, Miami Gardens, North Miami. And I was just going into these places, right, in some of the most craziest spaces to do climate workshops, to teach people. And I was using a cup of water and a cup of ice to teach sea level rise. I'll teach y'all my trick later. But people were catching on to it. Like, kids were going back home talking about climate change. People were understanding things and giving them small action steps, like how to decrease your carbon footprint, and not taking too much science to them, but letting them know and understand that this, your summer is hotter than it was 20 years ago, and this is why, right? Because they're feeling that. When I walk into the store, I'm having a hard time breathing. This is why this is happening. And it had to take that type of conversation to get in there and to talk to our community for them to understand how climate change affects them. I know that it's probably the most watered down way of teaching science, but when you're going into communities who already don't care about it, you have to figure out a way to give it to them where they can remember it quickly and also feel empowered to do something. Because sometimes, and I've been through a climate workshop where it scared me, I'm waking up thinking I'm drowning right now. So I had to learn how to deliver the message in a way that people will understand, and then also vice versa. When I come into rooms with people who don't understand underserved communities, undocumented communities, queer communities, and when I'm delivering the message back, especially those demands and the things that we need, also knowing and understanding how to explain equity to groups of scientists that sometimes just don't understand because they just don't have I don't think they don't care. I think they really do care. I just think that that's not always the conversation that's brought to them. And just thinking about how we can start to open up conversations on both ends, because the science community and the data community has a lot of information that we need to make our communities better, but I don't always know if our community understands how to absorb that and use that to their best advantage. And just to tap on Hurricane Irma, going into the storm, I had already talked, just 2 weeks before the storm, I had a meeting with Miss Susie, Miss Jane, and Mr. Jim at my office about equity, the 3 CROs, and we had a good conversation. They was really happy that I brought them into a room to talk about it. And right when the hurricane hit, as Ms. Caroline said, the storm didn't hit us directly, but we had people who were starving. People went into the storm with just 1 can of tuna. Some people could not get to the shelters. They get to the shelters, the schools are locked. The buses were free, but the bus barely shows up in Liberty City. So what is that during a hurricane? These people don't have 72 hours after the storm to wait until aid gets to them. And then we know, even though it may not be written down nowhere, but underserved communities are the last to get the service. So we created the Community Emergency Operations Center. Yes, that was me taking a jab at the county by naming my operation that. And we actually was able to get out into the community, and we served 23,000 people in a few days after Hurricane Irma. And since then, we've actually built out resiliency hubs around the county and in Broward County. So this is stretching across 2 cities. We've had numerous amounts of community meetings and conversations, re-granting dollars. Thank you to the Miami Foundation, who's been helping and assisting with that. All of the organizations that's been around it, including the CLEO Institute, Catalyst Miami, SMASH, New Florida Majority, Make the Home Smile. I mean, it's probably 50 or 60 organizations who came together to create a more equitable model around disaster response, because sometimes, honestly, people don't have the car to get across town to your water location. People do not have the ability to take off an extra week of work to stand in line for your food stamps. It's just those type of things that we have to think about as we are trying to grow as a community and together, because the water is coming, right? But I always say this, like, what is the city underwater to a community that can swim?
Bravo. Before we go to Adrian, let me just paint a picture for you of the town hall that Valencia led in Liberty City in 2014 or early 15. We asked them what they wanted to talk about. They wanted to talk about emergency preparedness and not being the next Katrina. They wanted to talk about climate gentrification and why they felt developers were predatorial in approaching them to sell their homes, knocking on their doors, informing homeowners that their home was in foreclosure even before they knew it was in foreclosure if they fell behind in taxes. That's two. The third thing they wanted is education. Why don't we know this? And the fourth thing they wanted is a seat at the table. And so what we've been doing since those town halls is working on all of that, making sure that Kilan's message it's about people, not just infrastructure. Make sure you have Valencia talking about the scope of need that's here. When we put the maps up of Miami-Dade County, and we show them 2, 4, 6, and 8 feet of inundation, and you're in Liberty City or Little Haiti at a town hall, and you show that map, the whole room just goes, that's why they want our property. Because at 2, 4, 6, and 8 feet, they're still dry. They're on the ridge. And that's the ridge where the railroad tracks were placed. And that's where the railroad tracks are, where the black and brown people settled. And now it's desirable land. So I say that because I think Adrian could bring home the crisis that's underfoot with the fact that we have this Alice report at almost 60% of 3 million people. And we have this gentrification issue, and he's trying to make sure everybody who wants an affordable home can get one. So Adrian, how do you do this?
Thank you so much, Caroline. And this is also, before I get started, a tremendous honor, and I really do appreciate you inviting me to be on this panel. And it's a pleasure to be in front of all of you today. So, again, my name is Adrian Madriz. I'm the executive director of SMASH, which is a community-driven developer of affordable housing. And one of our projects, our first project, is something called a community land trust, and it's located in Liberty City. And so some of you might be wondering, well, what does a nonprofit developer have to do with climate change and things like that? And I'm going to tell you. We focus very heavily on climate gentrification. And exactly like Caroline was explaining, and actually, as I'm sure Valencia would be able to explain significantly better than me, because she was the one who explained what climate gentrification was to me. Yeah, she is. She's a recruiter and a leader and a teacher to us all, and we really appreciate that. So climate gentrification is the gentrification of high elevation areas, which in Miami happen to also be the low income areas. And this is, you know, not a coincidence. These areas are these areas because Miami was built along the railroad tracks. The railroad tracks along it, the people who worked it were mostly people who were black, people of African descent, and they settled in those areas. And so the train track was built on the highest elevation land, and then people wanted to live closest to the water because they wanted to live closer to the beach. So it ended up that in these parts, the high elevation areas, black people, mostly low income people, ended up settling. And that's basically the layout of what it is today. The high elevation areas are Overtown, Liberty City, Little Haiti, and parts of Little Havana and Alapata. And those happen to be the low income black and brown neighborhoods of Miami as well. And so from the SMASH perspective, we look at this as really deeply concerning because, as always has tended to be the case with policies that are used by people in power, the government, corporations, whomever, to adapt to climate change, it's being done often to the detriment of these kinds of communities. And these communities are not the ones that are leading the conversations. They're not usually getting the seats at the table to be able to make decisions about how their specific neighborhoods are affected by these policies. And then they're the ones that end up suffering as a result. And the exact same thing is happening with regards to these low-income, high-elevation areas, which are now subject know that climate change is happening. They know it's not a hoax, and their insurers are especially aware of the fact that climate change is happening, which is why insurance rates are starting to rise in the coastal areas, and they're not rising in these high elevation areas. And it makes a lot of sense. So they want to build where their investment is going to be most protected, and that just happens to be where the lowest income people are. From our perspective, the best thing that we can do is to make sure that people of color, black and brown people, the people of these neighborhoods, actually have ownership of some of this land, of all of it, as much as possible. And we do this ideally through a model of communal land ownership called the Community Land Trust, which makes it so that now the community really does have stakeholdership in all of the land. But people still have the opportunity to own, and then the buildings that they owned are attached to the land through a ground lease, which is renewable every 99 years. And through this method, we're able to not only empower people to build wealth and to have a home that they own, but also we're able to make it so that when that home is sold, that it continues to be used by people from the community that also need affordable housing. And the reason we need this especially in these areas is because a lot of this land that we could be using for this purpose is disappearing as more and more people buy it up for investment and speculation. And it gets turned into things like condo towers and malls and very low income jobs, and all of these different things that we really don't need in our community, and that definitely aren't being requested by these neighborhoods themselves. And so, more than anything else, we want to emphasize that the people who should be making the decisions about our policies really should be these frontline communities. And when we think about just transition in general, let's not just think about how it is that we're going to move people from the peak of capitalism, industrialism jobs to the green economy. Let's also think about how it is that we're going to move them from the current infrastructure, which is extremely susceptible to the effects of climate change and disaster, to the new infrastructure, which is going to protect them from all of these different effects. We have a long history in this country, unfortunately, of making it so that when we are faced with certain kinds of climate disasters, we do make it so that not only we protect the people with the most amount of power, but if there is something to be sacrificed, that the people who are paying the brunt of that sacrifice are communities of color. And I'll just bring up the very specific example of Louisiana along the Mississippi River, which throughout its history has flooded its banks. And the settlement patterns along the Mississippi River reflect where it is that the banks are most likely to flood. So you have rich communities in the areas where there are levees and it's very heavily fortified, so it's not likely to flood. And then you have poor communities in areas that don't have that kind of security. After Hurricane Katrina, there was a conspiracy theory that went around that the reason that the lower Ninth Ward flooded was because somebody blew up the levees in that area. The theory was that if you blow up the levees in that area on that part of the river, then it would alleviate pressure on the other parts where some of the more affluent people lived. The levees did break, and there were many investigations that found that it was a barge that had essentially destroyed the levee because it ran into it because it had become unmoored during the storm. But the conspiracy theory was not without merit, because there have been times in the history of the Mississippi River where levees were actually destroyed for this very purpose. They knew that a flood was coming, and they wanted to make sure that private property owners, who were mostly white, were the ones that were protected. We are about to enter a very similar kind of a phase here in Miami, because as the affluent people move to the higher elevation areas, now the coastal areas and the flood-prone areas are going to become the ones that are more affordable. And that's just how the market works. And then people are obviously going to be pushed into these areas because those are the only areas that they can afford. And already with the kinds of options that they're dealing with, where they have to move into a slum building, or they have to go homeless, this will be just another one of those set of options that creates what I cynically call naturally occurring affordable housing. We can't allow this to happen. We have to really examine history and see how it is that people, especially black and brown people, have been the ones who have been most adversely affected by these kinds of policies, and we have to get ahead of that. And we have an opportunity to do that when it comes to our adaptation here in Miami. So I ask everybody to take away with them this message of let's make sure we do that. And we do that by making sure black and brown people and the people of these neighborhoods are the ones that are in the seats making the decisions.
Okay, so my follow-up question for each of you, and I'm going to start with you, Kilan, is what's a success story look like for you? You and I spoke a lot about your version of intentionality, where you think if people want to do the right thing, this lovely man here who's in the audience quotes Teddy Roosevelt, do what you can where you are with what you have. It's a beautiful thing. I would say do that as a minimum and do everything else on top of that too. But what do you mean, and what does success at that level look like?
Right. So I don't usually say much. I don't have to, because when I came on to the Sea Level Rise Committee, I came as a conduit for these people who not only have the knowledge, but also have way more of a background than I do. What I bring to the table is my education. I walk the walk. I talk the talk. I'm a great communicator. I'm a great conduit for their messages. And that's been the role that I took, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. And this city would look a lot different if everyone took that approach of not doing what they felt like they had to do, but advocating on behalf of those who may not have the resources or maybe the knowledge to advocate for themselves just yet. And that doesn't mean that those resources aren't coming. But if you know that something like climate gentrification is happening and is happening now, do you wait for that community to realize what's happening and let them handle it or get ahead of it, and start those conversations and do what you can to mitigate that effect? A lot of people will pass off the responsibility, and that's our issue. That's the issue. That's an American issue. It's a human issue. If it's not right in front of you, if it's not affecting you, if it's not affecting the people closest to you, maybe your family or your friends, or not affecting people that you care about, that you really, really care about deeply, then you'll just write it off as not being your issue. But like I said, the city would look a lot different, and this issue would be in a different place if we were all advocating for each other. And we were all using our privileges to advocate for those who have less privilege, have less time to go to committee meetings, to go to municipal meetings, to go to community meetings. We all know it's not very hard to figure out what people care about. There might be an op-ed you can read, you can have a conversation, you can go to a community-based organization like SMASH or like New Florida Majority or like CLEO. You can get a pulse as far as what's going on, what people are talking about. And success to me looks like when people start to go, okay, this isn't something that's personally affecting me, but this is an area where I can have an impact, where I can help other people. We'll be able to make a lot more progress a lot more quickly.
Beautiful. Well said. Thank you, Kilan. And Miss V, I remember before Irma struck, she called me up. She goes, Miss Caroline, we got to have a meeting. We got to get ready for our people. So we had a meeting. We called all the community-based organizations together before Irma came, and there was mass. I don't know if you remember, but Irma caused so much traffic jam. And I remember, want you to know what privilege looks like. Privilege looks like everyone in here who got in the car and drove somewhere. Because those who didn't have that don't have privilege. And what Valencia said to me is, find out who needs what. Because we had all these lists of the people we'd been working with in these communities of under-resourced residents. And so CLEO's role was to make the call to find out if they need food, if they need transportation, if they need plywood. And so we said, okay, and then get her the information. By the third call, She said to me, leave me alone. I have no more capacity. We were maxed out on the need and the ability to meet the needs of the people. So Valencia, tell us what success looks like with all these challenges we face.
Well, I remember that day I was just reminiscing because I was cursing and all. She gave y'all a nice version. I just have this motto. Can I curse? No.
Go for it.
Okay. You can't clean shit if you don't want to touch it. And oftentimes we think because they live in a certain area or a certain zip code, they look a certain way or they dress a certain way, that we can help them from where we are and like throw something at them, like how FEMA was doing the people in New Orleans, like dropping water from the helicopter, which was foolishness. Yeah, I think like a lot of times we want to drop the water from the helicopter. And oftentimes that's one of our biggest issues on why people are not educated and why most of the times they don't have what they need to be okay. Sending out an email probably won't be best for the communities that we are up here talking about, right? So when I geared up and I got into action around the hurricane, I just was like, okay, they need stuff, we need to give it to them. We can get it. We have enough influence. We have enough of a network that we can make phone calls to get stuff into Miami for these communities. And what was happening, the reason why I told Miss CLEO to relax, Miss CLEO, I always call you that.
You're not alone.
Ms. Caroline, to hold off on the calls is because everybody was calling me. I mean, from elected officials to other entities inside of the county and these different cities and municipalities. Like I was the only person who could get to the hood. That's what you would have thought. People from out of town calling, like, where do we send trucks? Where do we do all of these things? And even though I had a whole huge team of organizations and people, and Ecotech Visions gave us their whole warehouse for us to use and all of this stuff, and I'm telling everybody, like, we're going to Ecotech, and we're going to be there, and we're going to help the people, and I went in there with no food, not a cooler, not a piece of ice, and nothing. I don't know what I was thinking. And y'all all jumped off the bridge with me. But we were able to help out so many people. I took the grill from my house, and other people started to bring things. And we started just going to different neighborhoods from Liberty City to Little Haiti. And then people were calling us like, if you can send us some stuff to Homestead, we'll go to the park and we'll start grilling. And it was just happening so organically. 500 volunteers from across the county stood up and responded to their neighbor, right? And when we created the Community Emergency Operations Center, our motto is your neighbor is your first responder. So success to me is preparing like the government is not coming. That's what it looks like. I would hope always that our government is means well and will show up eventually, or not just government. Let me not do that. A lot of the large institutions that contract with the government, right? Because a lot of that does fall on them, will learn to respond better when it comes to these underserved communities. But people in Liberty City and Little Haiti, like, we know we're not going to see Red Cross. We know we're not going to see FEMA. We know we're not going to see FPNL for 2 weeks. So they already prepared. The good thing about Miami is the fact that we are a beautiful melting pot from the Caribbean islands in South America. So most people here have already experienced climate disasters. Most people here are climate refugees, especially our Haitian brothers and sisters. And they know how to survive without, government help or large institutions coming in. However, this is America, and the big institutions in the government should respond to us. But honestly, when I go out and I prepare, and what success looks like to me is community members stepping up. We're using all of our own brain power, our knowledge, and everything. So we had Dr. Armin Henderson. He's a doctor at University of Miami. He actually stepped up, and then a lot of other nurses and doctors started to follow him around these neighborhoods, just checking blood pressure, telling people ways to keep their insulin cool, making sure we give them a cup of ice to even stick their insulin in. I know that may not be the best option, but when your refrigerator doesn't work and you have nowhere to put it, that was something. So just organically happening. And then you had the conscious contractors, I don't know if Michael is still here, but these guys were going around cleaning up debris on their own. They was putting up the shutters and the plywood, and they was going back to these homes for free, removing trees, helping people as much as they possibly can when it came to like the infrastructure and the cleaning up and things of that nature. And then we had to call people in like CJP because we had landlords evicting senior citizens in Alapata. 3-4 days after the storm, we met these people, senior citizens, sleeping outside, right? Had we not walked neighborhoods, we wouldn't have found these individuals. So it was just stuff like that, and I just want us to learn and understand that even though we are in a country, a great country like America, it doesn't always mean that every American is going to be treated the same. I love quotes, and I always make them up. So after Hurricane Irma, I started to think about this. We are a first world country that creates second-class citizens that have to live in third-world situations. And that's what happens after natural disasters in America, honestly, all the time. Like having no lights in a food desert and high crime, that is a mess. I live in Liberty City, and I am privileged enough to have a weather-ready house. Every house I create or build in Liberty City, I'm prepared for a storm. But my neighbors weren't. And nothing, your house means nothing when it's digital and the light's off. My front door kept swinging open, just hoping to God nobody comes in and rob me. Like, those are the things that people have to think about after a storm. So when they say a threat multiplier, how do we make sure our communities are safe when the lights are off? How do we make sure people eat not 72 hours, but within 8 hours of a storm? How do we help our senior citizens who are stuck in these high rises, right? Good thing we got young folks who could carry bags of ice up the stairs. But what if we didn't have that? What does resiliency look like? And that to me is success, is preparing as if the government or the large institution is not coming. And also, once we do that, then also having better conversations with the government. With our local government did a lot after Hurricane Irma, especially with the $200 million that they put into resiliency, and what else they did? They stopped landlords from evicting people after storms, and it's just a lot of different things they put into place. And shout out to 100 Resilient Cities, because the whole conversation in that meeting shifted after Hurricane Irma. Now equity, food safety, and your health and everything is to the top of the conversation, which it wasn't 2 years ago. So that's what success looks like to me.
So before I get Adrian to give me his success story, takeaway is this. Valencia Gunder went from 0 to 110 seconds. Did I have a clue who she was? Did she have a clue what climate was before we met? Do not underestimate your power to influence others. And because CLEO's executive director, Yoka Aditi Rocha, and the incredible Chica Power staff that we have running this CLEO Institute, was building on the pilot, they came up with a concept that Kilan and I talk about, intentionality. We want to go after more Valencias. So we've created our outreach program as the Empowering Resilient Women and Girls campaign. And that's what we do in these cities. We teach them how to advocate for themselves, how to take care of their own selves. We listen. Each of these people has spoken, and all of the people who work on the climate justice front come and work with us in these communities. So kudos to you, Yoka, for that, and to the whole staff for branching out into Alapata. Olivia, where are you? The soul behind this Empowering Resilient Women and Girls. It is a phenomenal effort that just keeps going and going and scaling. So that would be our success story, that we build more of this. So Adrian, we all have to live somewhere and we have to be able to afford it. What does success look like?
Thank you for asking. So I think some examples of success not only focus on what kind of development we'll be living in, but also how does that development get to be there? What's the process that it goes through to being there? And democratic processes and community engagement processes have been certainly one of the main focuses of our organization. It is arguably the focus of SMASH. We look at different models of how it is to best do that. And a really good model is the CEOC model that Valencia put together. Because of the CEOC, there wasn't just one central location where people could go to get resources and materials that they would need in order to be able to withstand the storm. There were different staging locations set up, but we called them something else. What are they called?
Community hubs.
The resilience hubs, right?
Yeah.
Resilience and disaster hubs, yeah. And so the place where we're actually building the SMASH Community Land Trust is one of those hubs. And we're very honored to be able to take that kind of a role in the community, because for that immediate neighborhood, there really wasn't anybody doing that kind of work. And it's very, very important, not only after the storm, but before the storm, so that everybody's really prepared, and before we even have, you know, a passive conversation about what we do to build after the storm, we're really making sure to prevent a lot of those different things from happening in the first place. But going back to democratic processes, I want to highlight the democratic process that we went through for our first housing project, and what that went through and what we felt was a dignified way of building it. Number one, we went through a gauntlet when it came to just getting the land and the money to be able to build our first project. Why did we go through a gauntlet? Because we were a group of people from the neighborhood, Liberty City and Overtown. We had no development experience, no engineering experience, nobody had ever put together a pro forma, no architects, nobody. It was literally just people from the neighborhood, and we decided we're going to build some affordable housing. Affordable housing, by the way, is really hard to build, in case anybody was wondering. Especially in Miami. Real quick question. Raise your hand if you think that Miami is an affordable place to live.
Not one.
Not one person. Every single time I ask that question, unanimous consensus on that. It's very, very expensive, for sure. And it's also expensive to build. So that's one of the reasons why. So we went around asking first for money, so that we could build a project. And we went around to different banks and CDFIs and all different in the city and the county, and we said, hey, we'd love to be able to do this community project. Can we please have some money, please? And they would always come back and say, oh, you know, this is such a great idea. I love everything that you're doing, community control and the people of the community running it. Oh, it's beautiful, wonderful. Come back to us when you have some land. So we would then take that message and go to people who have land, city, county, landholders, churches have a lot of land actually, and anybody who would listen to us. And we'd be like, hey, you know, we'd like to be able to do this community-driven housing project. Can we have some land, please? And they'd be like, oh, wow, this is an awesome project. I mean, I just love the fact that the people are running it, and then they communally control the land. Oh, it's so great, it's fabulous. Come back to us when you have some money. And we did that ping pong kind of a game for about 3 years before we finally found our first plot of land. And then once we got the land, we were able to get the financing for it. As soon as we got site control of this land, because we knew that we wanted to follow a very dignified process in terms of how it was developed, we had, the site control agreement was signed, I want to say, on the 2nd of August of 2018, and then on the 4th of August of 2018, we had the first meeting of the neighborhood to announce to just the neighborhood, before we announced to anybody else, that we had gotten site control of this land in their area and that we wanted them to be a part of the process to be able to develop it. And that was before we put out a press release. That was before we let anybody else know. It was first the neighborhood that was notified of everything that was going on. Our board as well, I have to mention, our board is comprised of people from Liberty City and Overtown. So even at the inception of the organization, even at the founding, we were always thinking how it is that we can make sure that this is truly a product of community control. There was a 5-month first housing project. So that took us from August to December. And now, and then after that process concluded, we went back to the neighborhood and we had an actual vote, almost like a mini referendum of just those 4 square blocks. And we asked everybody, look, these are the plans, this is what you, the people of the community, helped us design, and we're bringing it back to all the folks who maybe weren't a part of that process, but we still want you to be a part of the process somehow. Do you approve of this project? We asked that very simple question, and we got 89% of the neighborhood to approve the project.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a really big deal. And so we're really, really proud of that. And so now that's the project that we're going to build, and we're in the process right now with the building department to figure out permitting, and we're also searching for engineers. But the thing that I really want to emphasize with these democratic processes is not just how it is that they should be done, but also how important it is to resource them correctly. Because Caroline, when you opened up this particular panel, you talked about a lot of the community outreach that you do. Is it fair to say that that community outreach, if you want to do it well, is cheap?
No.
No, right? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And that's one of the things that often is missing from these conversations, because we talk so much, especially because there's a lot of money that's about to be spent in terms of adaptation and making sure that our infrastructure is resilient. And we oftentimes lose sleep thinking about how much money we really have to spend in order to do it properly. But we also can't forget to talk about the amount of money that it takes to really properly engage the community in the conversations about how the rest of that money will be spent. And that is probably the most critical amount of money that needs to be thought about. Maybe having to move entire neighborhoods because they're in flood-prone areas. Or, you know, who's going to get the housing that's built that's actually going to be resilient? Or, you know, what kinds of policies are we going to have to adopt as a county, as a city, so that we can make sure that we actually survive sea level rise? And when you know, it's 20 years from now and there's 6 feet more water rolling down our streets, we are not going to want to have these kinds of policies fail politically because we didn't go out there and make sure people were aware and were on board with all of the different things that we were advocating for. And the only way to get that kind of buy-in is to give people real, actual power and dignity in the process. And that kind of stuff, it takes money. It takes a lot of money. I'm not going to get around it. It takes tons and tons and tons of money, and we are not having that conversation. Somebody is going to end up paying for all of this infrastructure that we have to do. It will have to be somebody. Who we determine that person or that demographic to be will say a lot about us as a society.
Yeah.
A lot. And I would really, really push everyone in this room to make sure that we make the right decision about that.
I am absolutely positive you have questions, but we cannot take them. So I will no, I mean, this is a rich conversation. We haven't even, the health panel earlier talked about the justice issues. So I just want you to know that this is the tip of the iceberg. You have a lot of weaving to do to make sure justice remains on your agenda. And that if we don't have a viable workforce, none of our businesses can thrive. So I thank you to this esteemed panel and to you all for giving us the time to share our lens of what climate justice looks like. Thank you.